The day my daughter moved into her first home should have been a celebration, but instead, it turned into a battlefield, with an HOA Karen leading the charge. The moving truck hadn't even made it out of the neighborhood when the trouble started. My daughter, Emily, was still dragging boxes across the driveway, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, sweat clinging to her forehead from hours of lifting. It was supposed to be one of the happiest days of her life, the day she officially moved into her very first home. She had worked years for this, saving every extra penny from her military paychecks, skipping vacations, denying herself luxuries most people her age indulged in. And finally, she had something to show for it, a beautiful townhouse in what was supposed to be a safe, quiet community. But safe and quiet doesn't exist when there's a Karen in the mix. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her. You couldn't miss her. Sharp blonde bob cut that looked like it hadn't moved in years, oversized sunglasses that covered half her face, and an attitude that screamed entitlement. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-declared queen of the HOA. If a blade of grass grew 1 inch too tall, she was the first to send a notice. If your garbage bin sat on the curb for 5 minutes too long, you'd hear about it. And when she saw Emily hauling boxes into her new home, Karen practically smelled blood. She marched across the lawn like she owned the entire block, heels clicking against the pavement, her handbag swinging at her side like a weapon. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Emily paused, brushing dust from her hands. "Yes?" she answered politely, though she could already tell this wasn't going to be a friendly welcome. Karen tilted her chin up, glaring down her nose as though she were inspecting a soldier during boot camp. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" Emily blinked, confused. "I'm moving in. I bought this house." She pointed toward the townhouse, her tone calm, almost cheerful. But Karen's lips curled into a smirk, the kind of smile that dripped with venom. "You bought it? You?" She let out a scoff that could have soured milk. "Sweetheart, this is a private HOA community. We don't just let anyone move in. There are standards, rules. People like you don't just show up with a moving truck and claim ownership." The insult wasn't subtle. Emily froze, the weight of Karen's words sinking in. People like you. She didn't have to spell it out. She had judged Emily in a split second, and in her narrow, power-hungry mind, Emily simply didn't belong. Emily could have argued. She could have lashed out. But instead, she took a deep breath and turned back to her moving boxes. "I appreciate your concern," she said evenly, "but I've got it handled." And that's when Karen lost it. "How dare you ignore me?" she snapped, her face turning redder by the second. "This is exactly the problem. Outsiders think they can just waltz in and do whatever they want. Not in my neighborhood." She yanked her phone from her handbag with theatrical flair. Emily froze again. Was she actually doing this? Sure enough, Karen dialed with trembling fingers and pressed the phone to her ear. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser," she said loudly enough for half the street to hear, her eyes locked on Emily like a hawk circling prey. "Yes, a young woman. She's moving boxes into a house she doesn't own. No, she doesn't. Live here. I'm on the HOA board, and I'm telling you she does not belong." Emily stood rooted in place, a box still in her arms. A wave of disbelief washed over her. She had just signed her closing documents less than 24 hours ago. The keys had been in her hand for less than a day. And already she was being treated like a criminal, not by the police, but by a neighbor who thought the HOA gave her the right to decide who was worthy and who wasn't. As Karen hung up the phone, she smirked with satisfaction, arms crossed, her victory already claimed in her mind. "The police are on their way," she announced smugly, like a queen declaring judgment. "And when they get here, we'll see just how long you last in this neighborhood." Emily set the box down gently, her heart pounding, but her eyes steady. She didn't know exactly how this would play out, but she knew one thing. Karen had just picked the wrong person to mess with, and within minutes, the sound of sirens in the distance made it clear. This wasn't going to be just a bad first impression. This was war. The sirens faded as the patrol car slowed in front of the house, lights flashing just enough to draw the attention of every neighbor within sight. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted, and suddenly the quiet street looked like a stage with half the community as its audience. Emily stood on her driveway, arms folded across her chest. Steady, but simmering with anger she worked hard to contain. She didn't want to start her new chapter this way, but it wasn't her choice. It was Karen's, and Karen was ready to milk. The moment for every ounce of attention. "There she is, officer!" Karen barked, before the cops even had the chance to close their doors. She jabbed her finger toward Emily like she was pointing out a fugitive. "That's her! That's the trespasser. I told you, she's trying to move into this house without permission. This is a private community and she doesn't belong here." The officer adjusted his hat and walked slowly up the driveway, his partner close behind. His expression wasn't hostile, but it was serious. "Miss, may I see some identification, please?" Emily calmly reached into her pocket, pulled out her driver's license, and handed it over without flinching. "I actually closed on this house yesterday," she said evenly. "The keys are mine, and I have the purchase documents inside if you'd like to see them." Karen let out an exaggerated laugh, the sound sharp and grating. "Oh, come on, officer. Don't tell me you're going to fall for that. Anyone can print off fake papers and wave them around like they mean something. I've been on the HOA board for 12 years, and I can tell you right now, people like her don't own homes in this neighborhood. She's probably squatting. That's what these people do." The venom in her words made Emily's jaw tighten. She could handle being doubted, but being disrespected so openly? That was different. Still, she forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't about to let Karen see her crack. The officer glanced at the documents Emily retrieved from the entryway and skimmed them. "Everything looks legitimate," he said, nodding. But Karen wasn't having it. She stepped closer, invading Emily's space, her face flushed with outrage. "Don't be naive, officer. I've lived here long enough to know when someone doesn't belong. She's making a mockery of our rules. You should remove her immediately before she drags this neighborhood down." Emily had heard enough. Slowly, she pulled out her wallet again, this time hesitating for only a second. She hadn't wanted to use this card, not because it embarrassed her, but because she wanted to be treated like everyone else. But clearly, Karen wasn't going to allow that. If Karen needed proof, she was about to get it. Emily extended her hand and revealed her active duty military ID. The officer's eyes immediately softened. His posture shifted, his tone warmed, and in an instant, his demeanor changed from cautious to respectful. He handed it back with a nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you for your service, ma'am." It wasn't just gratitude in his voice. It was a subtle declaration that Emily wasn't just another homeowner. She was someone who had sacrificed for her country, someone who had earned more respect than Karen could ever demand with her HOA title. But the most powerful reaction wasn't from the officer. It was from Karen. The moment her eyes landed on that military ID, the color drained from her face. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no words came out. The smug confidence, the arrogance, the self-importance, it all evaporated in a blink. For the first time since she stormed onto Emily's driveway, Karen looked powerless. The officer glanced at Karen, his expression unimpressed. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "this young woman is the legal owner of this property. She has every right to be here. Calling in a report like this, when you clearly had no evidence, is a waste of police resources." Karen's head snapped toward him, panic flickering across her face. But, she doesn't look like enough," the officer interrupted, holding up his hand. "She has shown proof of ownership and she has provided military credentials. This matter is closed. I suggest you return to your home." Emily stood quietly, watching Karen squirm under the weight of humiliation. The neighbors who had been peeking from their windows were now openly watching from porches and sidewalks, whispering to each other. Some looked disappointed, others amused, and a few even nodded in silent support of Emily. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound followed. Her cheeks burned crimson as she fumbled for an excuse, but none came. Finally, with a sharp huff, she spun on her heel and stormed off down the sidewalk, muttering incoherent insults under her breath. Emily exhaled slowly, relief washing over her as the patrol car pulled away. She had stood her ground. She had stayed calm. And now the neighborhood had witnessed something Karen couldn't erase, her downfall. But Emily also knew something else. Karen wasn't done. People like her never quit after one defeat. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. For the first time since Emily had stepped foot in her new home, the silence was on her side. Karen, the woman who had strutted across the lawn like she ruled the block, now stood frozen in embarrassment. The smugness that had oozed from her every word was gone, replaced with the pale, tight-lipped look of someone who had just realized. She'd picked the wrong battle. The neighbors, who had been lingering quietly at their windows, now started edging further out, their curiosity outweighing their caution. They had just watched their so-called neighborhood enforcer get put in her place, and it was a sight none of them were going to forget. The officer's words still hung in the air. This matter is closed. And as much as Karen wanted to spin the situation back in her favor, there was no undoing what had happened. She had called the police on a lawful homeowner, humiliated herself in front of the community, and worst of all, underestimated someone who wasn't just capable of standing up for herself, but who carried the weight of service to her country behind her. Karen's voice cracked as she tried one last, desperate attempt to save face. I was just doing my duty as a board member, looking out for the neighborhood. Anyone could have been moving in here. You can't be too careful these days. The officer shot her a look that was halfway between disbelief and annoyance. Ma'am, there's a difference between being cautious and making baseless accusations. I'd recommend you be more careful before involving law enforcement in the future. It wasn't harsh, but it was firm. And that firmness hit harder than any shouting match ever could. Karen's authority had just been publicly dismantled, not by Emily, but by the very system she thought she could manipulate. Emily finally spoke, her voice steady and clear. You thought I didn't belong here. You tried to use fear and intimidation, to push me out before I even had a chance to unpack a single box. But you were wrong. I've fought harder battles than this, and I can tell you one thing, I don't scare easy. The murmurs from the neighbors grew louder. A man across the street gave a small nod of approval. A woman 2 houses down whispered something to her husband that made him chuckle. Even the kids who had been playing basketball earlier were now sitting on their porch steps, watching in awe. The tide had turned, and Karen knew it. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her shoulders stiff, she spun around without another word. The sharp click of her heels echoed across the pavement as she stormed off toward her house, her pride trailing behind her in tatters. The officers tipped their hats toward Emily before heading back to their patrol car. One of them gave her a look that said more than words ever could. A mix of respect and reassurance. And then, just like that, they were gone. The flashing lights faded, and the only sound left was the quiet hum of a neighborhood that had just witnessed something extraordinary. Emily let out the breath she had been holding, her chest rising and falling with relief. She hadn't wanted a confrontation, not on her very first day, but life had a funny way of forcing battles onto your doorstep. And she had handled it the only way she knew how, with composure, with strength, and without giving Karen the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Emily sat on her porch with a cup of water, replaying the events in her mind. She thought about how Karen's face had changed the moment her military ID was revealed. It was as if the truth had burned straight through Karen's armor of arrogance. For someone who thrived on control, Karen had been exposed in the most public way possible. What Emily didn't realize yet was that the encounter had done more than protect her from Karen's harassment. It had shifted the balance of power in the entire neighborhood. For years, Karen had operated unchecked, scaring people into silence with threats of HOA fines and endless rules. But now everyone had seen her crumble. Everyone had witnessed the limits of her so-called power. And in a community where fear had kept people quiet, that moment planted a seed that would soon grow into something Karen had no control over: unity. Emily had no idea that by simply standing her ground, she had just inspired her new neighbors in ways she couldn't yet see. Karen wasn't the queen of the block anymore. Her crown had cracked. And it wouldn't be long before the people she had controlled with fear started to realize that they didn't have to bow down to her demands anymore. For Emily, the day had been exhausting. Her muscles ached from hauling furniture, and her mind replayed the confrontation in a loop. But even through her fatigue, she couldn't help but smile. She hadn't just moved into a house. She had moved into a neighborhood where her presence had already made a difference. Karen might have thought she could bully her into leaving, but instead, she had only strengthened Emily's resolve to stay. This was Emily's home now. And no HOA Karen was ever going to take that away from her. In the days that followed, something interesting happened. Neighbors who had once been silent started reaching out to Emily. A plate of cookies from the couple next door. A welcome card slipped into her mailbox. Even the HOA president, a man who clearly had tolerated Karen for too long, stopped by to apologize. "I heard what happened," he admitted sheepishly. "Karen tends to overstep. I just want you to know that not all of us are like that. We're glad to have you here." Emily appreciated the gesture, but she couldn't help but notice the shift in the neighborhood dynamics. Karen, who used to strut around like the ruler of the block, now avoided eye contact. The very people who once tolerated her antics were suddenly distancing themselves. It was like her mask had finally been ripped away for everyone to see. One evening, Emily sat on her porch sipping tea when a group of kids waved to her. "Thank you for your service," one of them shouted. She smiled, realizing that what Karen had meant for humiliation had turned into respect and unity. Karen, however, wasn't done. Every so often, Emily would catch her peeking through curtains or glaring from across the street. But the difference was clear. Karen wasn't feared anymore. She had been exposed. Weeks later, Emily looked back on that chaotic first day in her new home. It wasn't how she planned to start her life in the neighborhood, but in a strange way, it had given her a gift: the respect of her neighbors and the knowledge that she could stand tall against anyone, HOA or not. Karen still lurked in the background, but her voice had been silenced. No more false reports, no more screaming about standards. Everyone knew the truth now. She was nothing more than a bully who had been outsmarted and outclassed by someone she underestimated. Emily often thought about that moment when she held out her military ID. It wasn't just a card. It was proof of everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed, and everything Karen would never understand. And for anyone watching this story right now, there's a lesson too. Bullies only have power if you let them. Sometimes, standing your ground is all it takes to turn the tables. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about how real people stand up to HOA bullies and neighborhood villains, make sure to subscribe to the channel. More jaw-dropping stories like this one are coming and you won't want to miss them.